In this electronic lecture, we will be talking about the norma basalis interna, externa, and the mandible. Here is the inner aspect of the skull base. As you can see, it's divided into three parts: anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and here posterior cranial fossa. This is side view of our brain. راح نحكي briefly عن ال parts of the brain. Here we have the cerebrum بالعربي المخ, and here the cerebellum المخيخ, and finally the brainstem جذع الدماغ. Superior aspect of the brain, as you can see, it's divided. The cerebrum is divided by this longitudinal fissure into right and left hemispheres. Each hemisphere is divided into lobes, and these lobes are named according to the overlying bone. For example, here, the lobe of the brain located under the frontal bone is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe under the parietal bone, occipital lobe under the occipital bone, and finally temporal lobe under the temporal bone. Under the occipital lobe, we have here cerebellum. This is sagittal section of the brain. We are viewing the medial side of the right hemisphere. Here is cerebrum, cerebellum, and also the cerebellum is divided into two hemispheres, right and left. Anterior to cerebellum, we have the brainstem, which continues here as spinal cord. The parts of the brainstem from superior to inferior: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and here at the base of the skull, we have large foramen where the medulla oblongata continues as a spinal cord. So the brain lies inside the cranial cavity, and it lies on the base of the skull. Here the anterior cranial fossa contains the frontal lobes, the middle cranial fossa contains the temporal lobes, and the posterior cranial fossa contains the cerebellum and the brain stem. So again, the anterior cranial fossa contains the frontal lobes, the middle cranial fossa contains the temporal lobes, and the posterior cranial fossa contains the cerebellum, the two cerebellar hemispheres, and the brain stem. And through this large foramen magnum, the medulla oblongata continues as spinal cord. The cranial nerves. Cranial nerves, they are called cranial because they are connected to the brain. They are 12 pairs, right and left. They are named here according to their function, and also they were given numbers, Roman numbers, according to their emerging point from the inferior surface of the brain. So for example here, the first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. Olfactory, it means it's a sensory nerve. It carries olfaction, smell, sensations from the nasal cavity to our brain. Second cranial nerve is the optic nerve. Optic, it's for vision. It carries visual sensations. Here, cranial nerve number 3, 4, and 6. These three nerves move the eyeball. Oculo means eye. Motor, it means that it moves the eyeball. Trigeminal nerve, it's the 5th cranial nerve. Tri, it means that it's going to divide into 3 branches. Facial nerve is the cranial nerve number 7, العصب السابع, and it supplies the muscles of the face. Vestibulocochlear, الثامن. Vestibulo means balance. Cochlear means hearing. So this sensory cranial nerve carries sensations of hearing and balance. For example here, cranial nerve number 12 is hypoglossal. Glossal refers to the tongue, and this nerve moves the muscles of the tongue. You have to memorize the name of the cranial nerve and the number of the cranial nerve. The base of the cranial cavity, where the brain is located, and here is the inferior surface of the brain. As you can see here, emerging from the inferior surface, the cranial nerves, right and left cranial nerves, and they were given numbers according to their emerging point. So for example here, most anteriorly, we have the first cranial nerve, the olfactory nerve, and here most posteriorly, we have the hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve number 12. بالتالي, this is the first cranial nerve, second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on until cranial nerve number 12. And as you can see here at the base of the skull, we have these holes or fissures to permit the passage of the cranial nerves outside the cranial cavity. Inferior surface of the brain showing the emerging points for different cranial nerves. And here is the base of the skull showing the different cranial nerves passing through the holes at the base of the skull. For example here, this nerve is the trigeminal nerve. It's the fifth cranial nerve. It divides into 3 branches. So here at the base of the skull, it has to pass, these branches, they have to pass through certain holes at the base of the skull to reach their destination. For example here in green, this division is called ophthalmic nerve. It brings sensations from the skin of the face, this area. This branch is the maxillary nerve. It brings sensation from the skin here overlying the maxilla. And the third branch in blue, the mandibular nerve, which brings sensation from the skin here overlying the lower part of the face, overlying the mandible. The base of the skull in a review, here are the holes where the cranial nerves pass through. Starting with the anterior cranial fossa. The anterior cranial fossa, again, it contains the frontal lobes. And here, under this part, we have the right orbital cavity. Here we have, under this part, the left orbital cavity. And in between, we have the nasal cavity. In particular, the roof of the nasal cavity. So what forms the anterior cranial fossa is here, frontal bone, frontal bone. The frontal bone sends these horizontal plates forming the roof of the orbital cavity. These plates are called orbital plates of frontal bone. Also, we have here in the inner aspect of the frontal bone crest, the frontal crest. In between here, we have part of ethmoid bone. It's located exactly at the roof of the nasal cavity. And as you can see here, it contains these small holes for the passage of olfactory nerves. In the middle here, we have crest. This crest is the crista galli of ethmoid bone. Here, crista galli of ethmoid bone, it's called crista galli because it appears like the crest of rooster. And at the sides, we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid, this area which contains many holes for the transmission of olfactory nerves. Here, sagittal section, mid-sagittal section. This is the external nose. This is the nasal cavity. And as you can see at the roof of the nasal cavity, we have the cribriform plate of ethmoid for the transmission of olfactory nerves. So the olfactory nerves here carry smell sensation from the nasal mucosa to the frontal lobes of the brain. Anterior to crista galli, we have this foramen. It's foramen cecum. It's called cecum because usually in most people it's closed. Cecum means blind or closed. The final bone forming the anterior cranial fossa is the lesser wing of sphenoid. بداية the sphenoid bone is a complex bone. It has many parts. وهاي أحسن view الnorma basalis interna. This is the best view to view the different parts of the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone بيشبهوه إنه it's butterfly in shape or it's bat in shape. It has body. It has 2 lesser wings, 2 greater wings, and it has legs directed inferiorly. Here is the body of sphenoid, the lesser wings of sphenoid, greater wings of sphenoid, And in order to view the legs of sphenoid bone, we have to look at inferior or posterior aspects of the skull. Here the sphenoid bone is isolated. As you can see, it's butterfly in shape. It has body, two lesser wings, two greater wings, and legs directed inferiorly. ولاحظ هون between the lesser wing of sphenoid and the greater wing of sphenoid we have this fissure. We are going to talk about this fissure later on. The body of sphenoid, lesser wings, greater wings, and these plates are called pterygoid plates of sphenoid bone. We have one medial and one lateral. Medial pterygoid plate and lateral pterygoid plate. So here, norma, basalis, interna, different parts of the sphenoid bone, the body, greater wings, lesser wings, and here the posterior view of the skull. You can see the downward extensions of the sphenoid bone, the pterygoid plates of sphenoid bone. لاحظ هون إنه الميديال part or the medial end of the lesser wing of sphenoid forms this process, the anterior clinoid process. Medial to it, we have foramen, and lateral to it here, deep to the lesser wing of sphenoid, we have fissure. This fissure is the superior orbital fissure. It's located between the lesser wing of sphenoid and the greater wing of sphenoid. We cannot see it from this aspect. We have to look deep here under the lesser wing of sphenoid to see this fissure. It opens into the orbital cavity. So, to summarize, the anterior cranial fossa is formed by the orbital plates of frontal bone, the ethmoid bone in the middle, and here part of the body of sphenoid and the lesser wings of sphenoid. Now the middle cranial fossa, it's formed in the middle by the body of sphenoid, the greater wings of sphenoid, and here more posteriorly, temporal bone. Which parts? This part is, if you remember here, we saw this part from the lateral aspect of the skull, squamous part of temporal bone, and this part is the petrous part of temporal bone. The body of sphenoid, greater wing of sphenoid, and the temporal bone with its two parts, petrous part of temporal bone and the squamous part. Here note that only the anterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone participates in the formation of the middle cranial fossa. The petrous part is wedge in shape. It has apex here directed anteriorly. It has superior border, anterior surface, and posterior surface. واضح إنه الانterior surface is part of the middle cranial fossa, while the posterior surface is part of the posterior cranial fossa. Here, inside the greater wing of sphenoid, we have three important foramina running in posterolateral direction. Here is the greater wing, and here is three foramina, three holes. And these holes are arranged posterolaterally. The most anterior foramen and the most medial foramen is foramen rotundum. It's rounded, and that's why it's called rotundum. Then we have oval-shaped foramen, foramen ovale, and finally we have small foramen, foramen spinosum. ورح نفهم ليش سموها spinosum later on. Zooming in the greater wing of sphenoid, here rotundum, ovale, and spinosum. Deep to the lesser wing of sphenoid, we have fissure. This fissure leads to the orbit, and it's the superior orbital fissure. The location of the superior orbital fissure here between the lesser wing and the greater wing of sphenoid. Again, here is the trigeminal nerve. It's a mixed nerve. It has sensory part and it has motor part. Now we are going to focus only on the sensory part of the trigeminal nerve. This nerve divides into three branches, and these three branches bring sensation from the skin of the face. Since it's sensory here, so it forms a ganglion for the collection of the cell bodies of the sensory neurons. The first branch is ophthalmic. سموه ophthalmic لأنه it passes here through the orbit to bring sensations from this area of the face. So in order for this nerve to enter the cranial cavity, it has here to pass through the superior orbital fissure. Maxillary nerve brings sensations from this area of the face, and again it has to pass through certain foramen to enter the cranial cavity. And finally, the mandibular nerve brings sensations from this area of the face, and again it has to pass through certain foramen to enter the cranial cavity. Here, superior view, the roof of the orbit has been removed, and this is the lesser wing of sphenoid. Under the lesser wing of sphenoid, we have large fissure, the superior orbital fissure. Then we have foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and here the foramen spinosum. Here in the posterior cranial fossa, we have the brainstem. Originating from brainstem is the trigeminal nerve. It passes here. It forms this ganglion, the trigeminal ganglion. Then it divides into 3 branches to bring sensations from the skin of the face. The first branch, ophthalmic nerve, passes through the superior orbital fissure. It enters the orbit in order to reach the skin of the upper part of the face. The second branch is the maxillary nerve. It passes here through foramen rotundum. And the third branch, the mandibular nerve, passes through the foramen ovale. So this is the trigeminal ganglion. And these are the 3 branches of trigeminal nerve, ophthalmic nerve, maxillary nerve, and mandibular nerve. Now at the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone, we have this large foramen with a lacerated border. This foramen is foramen lacerum. In living subjects, it's closed by a fibrocartilage. Posterior to foramen lacerum, we have here impression for the trigeminal ganglion. Again, here we have the brainstem. Emerging from the brainstem, cranial nerve number 5. It forms a ganglion, sensory ganglion, for the collection of the cell bodies of sensory neurons. Then it divides into 3 branches. One, ophthalmic, passing through the superior orbital fissure. The maxillary passes through foramen rotundum, and the mandibular passing through the foramen ovale. Side view, here is the brainstem, medulla oblongata, pons and midbrain. As you can see here, the trigeminal nerve emerges from pons. It forms this large ganglion, the trigeminal ganglion. Then it divides into ophthalmic, passing through the superior orbital fissure, maxillary passing through rotundum, and mandibular passing through ovale. Petrous part of temporal bone, at the apex foramen lacerum, posterolateral to foramen lacerum, we have here canal for the internal carotid artery. Pituitary gland at the inferior surface of the brain. As you can see, it's suspended by this stalk, and it's located inside the base of the skull, protected inside a bony fossa. This bony fossa is called sella torsica or hypophyseal fossa. Hypophyseal لأنه الاسم الثاني للpituitary gland is hypophysis. The body of sphenoid. On its superior aspect, it has this depression where the pituitary gland is located. This area is called sella torsica, وسموها sella torsica لأنها بتشبه التركش saddle or the Turkish seat. Here in the middle we have concavity with anterior elevation and posterior elevation. Again, side view, we have depressed area with two elevations. The anterior elevation is called tuberculum silli. The posterior elevation is dorsal silli, and here in between we have fossa, the hypophyseal fossa, where the pituitary gland is located and protected. So here the anterior elevation, tuberculum silli, the posterior elevation is dorsum silli, and the lateral angles of the dorsum silli are called posterior clinoid processes. So we have here anterior clinoid processes, the medial ends of the lesser wing of sphenoid, and here we have the posterior clinoid processes, the lateral angles of the dorsum silli. The anterior elevation, tuberculum silli, the fossa, the hypophyseal fossa, and the dorsum silli with the posterior clinoid processes. Sagittal section. Here the depressed area on the body of sphenoid is the sella torsica or hypophyseal fossa with two elevations, one anterior and one posterior, tuberculum silli and dorsum silli. Medial to the anterior clinoid process, we have this foramen or canal for the transmission of the optic nerve. The optic nerve is the cranial nerve number 2. It brings sensations, visual sensations from the eyeball. اتذكر إنه eyeballs are located inside the orbital cavities exactly under the orbital plates of frontal bone. So here the optic nerve passes through the optic canal to enter the cranial cavity. The roof of the orbit has been removed, and this is the optic nerve passing through the optic canal. This is the outline of the optic canal to enter the cranial cavity. لاحظ برضو through this canal we have the ophthalmic artery passing along with the optic nerve through the optic canal. Now here we have right optic nerve and left optic nerve, and when they enter the orbital cavity they cross over each other to form optic chiasma. Chiasma means crossing over. The optic chiasma is located here in this area, so this area is called chiasmatic groove or sulcus chiasmaticus. Now the posterior cranial fossa, it's formed by the occipital bone, the inner aspect of the occipital bone. It's also formed by the posterior surface of the petrous part of temporal bone. This large foramen within the occipital bone is the foramen magnum. We have many structures passing here. Up to now نعرف إنه الميدولا oblongata continues as spinal cord. Here at the sides of the foramen magnum, we have two foramina or two canals for the passage of the hypoglossal nerves, so these are called hypoglossal canals. Between the petrous part of temporal bone and the occipital bone, we have this large foramen. This large foramen is called jugular foramen for the passage of the internal jugular vein. And here on the posterior surface of the petrous part, we have foramen, the internal acoustic meatus. اتذكر إنه درسنا هون على outer aspect of the temporal bone, external acoustic meatus, and here on the inner aspect of the temporal bone, we have internal acoustic meatus. On the inner aspect of occipital bone, we have protuberance, the internal occipital protuberance, ودرسنا external here on the external aspect of the occipital bone. Extending down toward the foramen magnum is the internal occipital crest. Again, this is the outline of the occipital bone, foramen magnum. This area, the slope, which is formed partially by the body of sphenoid and partially by the occipital bone, is called clivus. At the sides of the foramen magnum, we have two foramina for the passage of hypoglossal nerve, hypoglossal foramina or canals. On the posterior surface of petrous bone, we have internal acoustic meatus, And here the cranial nerves, number 7 and 8, pass through this opening. Again, we have here the brainstem, emerging from the brainstem, cranial nerve number 7, and cranial nerve number 8. So these two nerves pass through the internal acoustic meatus. This large foramen in between the petrous bone and the occipital bone is the jugular foramen, and here is the internal occipital crest with internal occipital protuberance. These two depressions are for the two cerebellar hemispheres, the right cerebellar fossa and the left cerebellar fossa. Now the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone is located here in between the two orbits. So it forms here part of the medial wall of the orbit, and here it forms part of the medial wall of the orbit. As you can see, the ethmoid bone has this perpendicular plate which participates in the formation of the nasal septum. So the bony nasal septum is formed by the perpendicular plate of ethmoid bone superiorly and the vomer bone inferiorly. Also, the ethmoid bone participates in the formation of the lateral nasal walls. Here the ethmoid bone is isolated. Here is the right orbit. Here is the left orbit. And here is the nasal cavity. As you can see, the ethmoid bone sends this vertical extension, the perpendicular plate of ethmoid, to participate in the formation of the nasal septum, and the nasal septum divides the nasal cavity into right and left halves. The ethmoid bone also forms the roof of the nasal cavity. This is cribriform plate of ethmoid where the olfactory nerves pass. This superior crest is the crista galli. Here the ethmoid bone has two lateral masses, and each lateral mass has two surfaces. Nasal surface here, participating in the formation of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. And here this surface is the orbital surface, which participates in the formation of the medial wall of the orbit, extending down the perpendicular plate of ethmoid. Here is the orbital plate of ethmoid. Now, norma basalis externa. The norma basalis externa contains the following bones. The first bone is the maxilla, and remember that the maxilla sends this horizontal plate to participate in the formation of the hard palate. The palatine process of maxilla, we have two processes unite here in the middle by this suture. Posteriorly, the hard palate is formed by palatine bone, in particular the horizontal plates of palatine bone. The palatine bone has basically two processes. It has horizontal plate and vertical plate, horizontal plate and vertical plate. So we have right and left palatine bones. The horizontal plates of the palatine bone participate in the formation of the hard palate. They form the posterior part of the hard palate. From this view, we can see the vertical plates of the palatine bone. The vertical plate here is in blue. It forms the medial wall of very important fossa راح تاخدوها بالrespiratory system. This small fossa is called pterygopalatine fossa. Pterygopalatine fossa, this area, and the vertical plate of the palatine bone forms its medial surface. This opening is the posterior nasal opening or posterior nasal aperture. It's divided by the vomer bone into right and left openings. Each opening here is called choana, posterior choana, so we have right and left choanae. This is sphenoid bone viewed from the inferior aspect. These are the pterygoid plates of sphenoid, and this is the greater wing of sphenoid. The pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone is divided into lateral pterygoid plate and medial pterygoid plate. Here we have important feature at the lower end of the medial pterygoid plate. This is called humulus of the medial pterygoid plate. Also from this aspect, we can view the inferior orbital fissure. It's located between the maxilla and the greater wing of sphenoid, the zygomatic bone, the temporal bone, the zygomatic arch, and the occipital bone. Now back to the hard palate. The most anterior area here, located behind the incisor teeth, is called incisive fossa. And in the middle we have foramen, incisive foramen. Posteriorly on the hard palate, we have two foramina, one large and one small. The larger one is the greater palatine foramen. The smaller one is the lesser palatine foramen. Again, for transmission of nerves and blood vessels with the same names. In this view, in the inferior view of the base of the skull, the greater wing of sphenoid here. In this view, we can see only two foramina in the greater wing of sphenoid. The oval one, foramen ovale, and posterior to it, the foramen spinosum. ليش ما بنقدر نشوف الروتندم؟ لأنه الروتندم it opens here into deep fossa, the pterygopalatine fossa, so we cannot view foramen rotundum in this view. This small triangular fossa is the pterygopalatine fossa. Here is the sphenoid bone. This is the greater wing of sphenoid, and this is the lateral pterygoid plate of sphenoid bone. ليش سمينا هاي الفصة pterygopalatine fossa؟ لأنه هون موجود ال vertical part in blue, the vertical part of the palatine bone, and here is the lateral pterygoid plate, so this fossa is called pterygopalatine fossa. Again, this is the greater wing of sphenoid, and the first opening in the floor of the greater wing of sphenoid is the foramen rotundum, and the foramen rotundum transmits the maxillary nerve, and it opens here in the pterygopalatine fossa. And that's why we cannot see foramen rotundum in this view. لأنها بتفتح على fossa deep below the apex of the orbit. يعني لو قلنا نوصف ال location of the pterygopalatine fossa بتقولي it's located, this is the orbit, والorbit شكله pyramidal in shape. Just below the apex of the orbit, we have the pterygopalatine fossa. The posterior nasal aperture divided into right and left nasal guani. اتذكر إنه anteriorly here on the anterior aspect of the maxilla أخذنا ال anterior nasal aperture, and here posteriorly we have the posterior nasal aperture. Here at the side of the temporal bone, the external auditory meatus, and here this fossa is the mandibular fossa that articulates with the head of the mandible to form the TM joint. This is again side view, mandibular fossa articulating with the head of the mandible, foramen magnum, and here the occipital bone is divided into four parts related to the foramen magnum. This part of the occipital bone is anterior to foramen magnum. These parts of occipital bone are lateral to foramen magnum, and this part of the occipital bone is posterior to foramen magnum. يسموا هذا البارت basilar part of occipital bone, anterior to foramen magnum, and this part, the flat part of the occipital bone, which contains the external occipital protuberance والcrest with two nuchal lines اللي درسناهم قبل. This part is called squamous part of the occipital bone. Lateral to foramen magnum, we have two condyles, the occipital condyles. These two condyles articulate with the first cervical vertebra. The first cervical vertebra is atypical vertebra. The other name for this vertebra is atlas. As you can see, it's atypical, it has transverse processes, it has no spinous process, and it has these two lateral parts to articulate with the condyles of occipital bone. The joint between the first cervical vertebra, between atlas and the occipital bone, is the atlanto-occipital joint. The atlanto-occipital joint is a synovial joint and it permits the nodding movement, like when you nod your head to say yes. External occipital crest, the external occipital protuberance, the two lines, the inferior nuchal line and the superior nuchal line. Now here, this is sphenoid, greater wing and pterygoid plates, and this part is the temporal bone. Here we can view the different parts of the temporal bone, the mandibular fossa, the external acoustic meatus, mastoid process, styloid process, and also here we can see the petrous part of temporal bone اللي شفناه من النورما basalis interna. Again here at the apex of the petrous part of temporal bone we have large lacerated foramen lacerum. Now posterolateral to foramen lacerum we have here the opening for the carotid canal for the passage of the internal carotid artery. إذا بتلاحظوا بالنورما basalis interna شفنا الأوبننج كانت here, the opening of the carotid canal. لأنها it's a canal, يعني here is the opening at the base of the skull, then the internal carotid artery passes through a canal to enter the cranial cavity. فإذا هاي الفتحة لما إذا أنت مسكت واير في اللاب وحاولت إنك تدخل السلك ما راح يطلع من ال inner aspect of the base of the skull لأنها عبارة عن canal within the bone. So here is the opening for carotid, internal carotid artery. Then we have this canal inside the bone. It opens here inside the cranial cavity. So we see this opening from the inner aspect of the skull. In this area we have the foramen lacerum. وحكينا إن الفورامين lacerum in living subjects it's closed by a cartilage. So here the internal carotid artery passes from this opening on the inferior aspect of the skull, then inside this canal, then it appears here in the middle cranial fossa, inner aspect of the skull, and it appears like it's emerging from foramen lacerum. لكن in fact the foramen lacerum is closed, so the internal carotid artery appears as emerging from foramen lacerum, but in fact it passes within this curved canal within the petrous part of temporal bone. بالتالي فتحة الكاروتيد canal على inferior aspect تختلف عن the superior aspect of the base of the skull because of this canal running between these two openings. Just posterior to the opening of the carotid canal, we have the jugular foramen, petrous part of temporal bone, foramen lacerum, posterior and lateral to foramen lacerum, the opening of the carotid canal. Posterior to the opening of the carotid canal is the jugular foramen. يعني jugular foramen يا بتحددها إنها posterior to the carotid canal or just lateral to the occipital condyle. The two processes from the temporal bone, the styloid and the mastoid process. And here we have very important foramen, here deep, here in between styloid and mastoid. This foramen is the stylomastoid foramen, where the facial nerve, العصب السابع, emerges to supply the muscles of the face. Here also we have very important notch on the medial aspect of the mastoid process. This notch is the mastoid notch. Now, المرة الماضية حكينا عن fossa located here at the side of the skull, the temporal fossa. قلنا it's located above the zygomatic arch, and below this fossa, deep to the mandible, we have the infratemporal fossa. So here the zygomatic arch has been removed and part of the ramus of the mandible has been removed to view the infratemporal fossa. The infratemporal fossa, it has roof formed by the greater wing of sphenoid, and here anterior wall formed by the back of maxilla, medial wall formed by the lateral pterygoid plate of sphenoid, and the lateral wall here is formed by the ramus of the mandible. لاحظ إنه deep inside here to the infratemporal fossa we have this small fossa. This small fossa here highlighted in green is the pterygopalatine fossa. Pterygopalatine fossa is located here at the apex, exactly below the apex of the orbit. It's triangular in shape and it's very small. طبعا هاي الفصة is very important، راح تاخدوها بالجي اي، بس مبدئيا this is the greater wing of sphenoid، وإحنا حكينا إنه here على الفلور we have the foramen rotundum. Here the maxillary nerve passes to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. برضو بدي إياكم تلاحظوا هذا الفشر. This fissure اللي هو opening between the infratemporal fossa and the pterygopalatine fossa. This fissure is called pterygomaxillary fissure. Pterygo, this is lateral pterygoid plate of sphenoid. Maxillary, this is maxilla. Pterygomaxillary fissure is the opening between the pterygopalatine fossa deep inside the small fossa and this large fossa, the infratemporal fossa. Now the mandible. The mandible is the lower jaw. It's a single bone and it's the only movable bone of the skull. It has two parts. This part is the body. It's U in shape. And here we have the mandibular rami, right ramus and left ramus. This junction between the body and the ramus is the angle of the mandible. Now here, anything related to the chin is called mental or genial. So this part here we have elevated area, the mental protuberance. Other side we have foramen, mental foramen for the passage of mental nerve and blood vessels. And here we have the alveolar process of the mandible carrying the lower teeth. يعني زي ما عندنا alveolar process of the maxilla carrying the upper teeth, we have alveolar process of the mandible carrying the lower teeth. Now the ramus of the mandible here at the superior aspect, it has two processes, one anterior and one posterior, and in between a notch, the mandibular notch. This process is the coronoid process of the mandible, and this posterior process is the condyle of the mandible or the condylar process of the mandible. It contains the head and the neck. The head here articulates with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone to form the TM joint. The condylar process containing the head and the neck, and just anterior to the neck, we have this fovea, the pterygoid fovea, the coronoid process, the mandibular notch. Now here, the anterior border of the ramus of the mandible continues on the outer aspect to form this oblique line here. Mental foramen, mental protuberance. Mentum, genio are related to the chin area of the mandible. Now on the medial surface of the ramus, we have this large foramen, the mandibular foramen. Mandibular foramen leads to a canal here inside the mandible. This canal we cannot view لأنها موجودة inside the bone. Here we have nerve, inferior alveolar nerve. It passes here and it sends small branches to supply the teeth. Anterior to the mandibular foramen here, we have triangular process called lingula. So here is the lingula. Here we have groove and we have line. Groove and line. The line is called mylohyoid line. Here we have muscle called mylohyoid muscle. It's attached to this line. And this muscle forms the floor of the oral cavity. It's supplied by a nerve to mylohyoid, and the nerve passes here in the groove. So that's why this groove is called mylohyoid groove, and this line is called mylohyoid line. Side view here, mental nerve passing through the mental foramen to supply the skin here of the lower chin and the lower anterior teeth. Anterior view showing the alveolar process of the mandible, mental foramina, mental protuberance, and on the inner aspect of the mandible deep inside, we have two spines, the mental spines. Below the mental spines, at the sides of the midline, we have the right and the left digastric fossa. طبعا كل اللاند ماركس اللي درسناهم البوني لاند ماركس are for muscles or ligaments attachment in the area of the head and neck.